Hey, Quicksilver, I forget. Who's the villain in Iron Man 2 again?
Whiplash.
The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. For a movie that opens with a lot of heroes being ripped apart and bodies dropped off a truck, X-Men Days of Future Past is really optimistic. The movie opens with a horrifying post-apocalyptic future in which unbeatable organic sentinels have almost completely wiped out the mutant race. Humans aren't faring much better, all hope is lost, and yet Charles Xavier still believes there's a way. And not just a way to cheat the system and literally rewrite history, but he believes, given another chance, mutants and humans can still learn to coexist, despite watching so many of his friends die. And then, when we go back in time to 1973, to Xavier's absolute rock-bottom lowest point, we see a version of him who has given up on that dream, who has traded his hope for all-consuming fear. And we get to see that man regain his confidence and become the uncompromising optimist again for really grounded reasons. It's not the only superhero movie that humanizes an incorruptible, selfless symbol of the best of humanity, not by a long shot. I discussed the importance of Captain America's constant struggle against his own potential to cave into the pressures of a cynical world last review. But this is another kind of example, about a man who gives into those pressures and manages to come back from it, as opposed to the man who never gives in. The message of the Captain America films is, we can all choose to stand up for what we believe in and never give up. This movie says, yeah, but it's also never too late. Days of Future Past is certainly a flawed movie, by its nature maybe, given the sordid history of this franchise and this movie's bold, perhaps nutty attempt at creatively hitting the soft reset button and trying to make things right, to quote The Force Awakens. I will certainly dissect it like Trask would a mutant on his examination table, but for all its inconsistencies and unanswered questions, it makes up for those in spades with its ambition, its heart, and its ability to inject buckets of fan service into a poignant and inspiring story. 2014 was a year full of surprises for superhero movies. Marvel gave us Captain America: The Winter Soldier, a movie that demonstrated you can make a dark suspense thriller in the superhero genre without losing the essence of the character or the joy of that high-concept world. Guardians of the Galaxy proved an offbeat, obscure property can become mainstream overnight if it scratches the right itch, and certainly it helps if it's made by a studio with a proven track record. And then there's Days of Future Past, a beloved comic story so complicated and so grand in scale, Bryan Singer says in a featurette on the Rogue Cut that it couldn't have been adapted back when he made the first one. I felt completely spoiled that year to see such enormous risks taken with all these projects. Each of them was daring, attempting something new for the genre while trying to make the familiar fresh and new again. But Days of Future Past seemed the most too good to be true. You're going to do a First Class 2 and an X-Men 4 at the same time. You're going to bring back a lot of the original cast and put a dozen or more X-Men all in a movie together after the disasters that were The Last Stand and X-Men Origins Wolverine. You're actually going to put McAvoy and Stewart's Xaviers on screen together. You're going to use this as a way to soft reboot the franchise so we're not stuck in prequel territory forever, and so we can maybe streamline and repair this wonky continuity. And Bryan Singer himself is going to come back to reboot his own continuity with a score by John Ottman. That's a spectacular sounding fan pitch. It's like the kind of thing you might expect to hear on Eric and Matt's Let's Do It Again. It sounds like a total pipe dream. The sort of thing 100,000 fans would give to a Kickstarter for before a studio would sign off on it. The only thing crazier than that would have been expecting Fox to greenlight a true-to-form Deadpool movie. At this point, nothing surprises me. If I found out tomorrow that Fin Fang Foom or Devil Dinosaur or MODOK were getting their own movies, I'd not only accept it without blinking, I'd expect they at least had the potential to make money and not suck. In fact, the only thing that seems impossible at the moment is for Fox to put out a well-received Fantastic Four movie. And that's the same studio. I was reminded on this viewing that X-Men is, to date, the longest-running superhero movie franchise without getting a full-on reimagining. And since this did that Star Trek 09 thing and rebooted out of original continuity, it still counts. It's what every crappy TV reunion movie and long-belated sequel wishes it was. A movie where all the principal actors are available, they're all happy to be there, the old characters are in character, aren't forced into a cliché, formulaic plot about illegitimate children they've had, or an unlikely back-in-the-saddle scenario, and that tells a story that's really satisfying for longtime fans and rewards them for their love of that old material. Well, I guess young Xavier finds himself in a back-in-the-saddle scenario here, but this one's interesting because it's a bump in the road of a life that's already behind a character we know, rather than an old guy going on one more adventure so a studio can squeeze a few more dollars out of a long-dormant property. I think Days of Future Past outclasses Star Trek 09 in taking the soft reboot concept to a whole new level. Some of that is because of when and why Singer did it as opposed to Abrams with Trek. That was the start of a brand new franchise, a way to reinvent a property while attempting to satiate the built-in fan base. But this was a way to get out of prequel land while still, at least for now, telling period stories. This one is also an inventive idea that came as a result of a story concept rather than a story concept that came from a marketing strategy. The notion of adapting Days of Future Past came first, according to Laura Schuler-Donner, who loves that storyline and talked about wanting to adapt it as early as 2006. What makes this watch like an organic progression of story rather than a cheap gimmick is that we're not introduced to the earlier versions of these characters through the time travel device. We get to explore their personalities and worldviews for a whole movie in first class. As I discussed when I reviewed that movie, it doesn't all match with pre-existing continuity, and it's unfortunate that Xavier and Magneto's friendship is truncated into a 2-week period before it goes south, but now the time travel premise becomes an unconventional way to build on a lot of well-laid track. Everything that happens is a result of choices our heroes make, both the original versions, in their part in creating this bleak future they end up with in the first place, and in the past, where the original versions influence history. But it's only in Xavier and Mystique choosing to change that the future is changed. And I've come to care about most of both sets of characters, so I'm completely invested, and I see each counterpart as a different person, similar to how the original 5 X-Men returning to the present day in Bendis' X-Men comics run become different people from their present-day counterparts. When the future X-Men die or are wiped out of history at the end of this, I don't see them as throwaway versions that didn't really exist. I see those as sacrifices those people made, so their younger selves had a chance and their children would have a future. When Xavier tells Wolverine he's helping Raven for Raven and not for his friends in the future, he's seeing them all as different people, even if he knows them, and he's right. The Xavier Wolverine meets after time has been altered at the very end is the one that knew him in 1973, the one that made the promise to train and guide him and his friends. Luckily, the names Storm, Scott, and Jean were enough for him to go on. I guess he must have read Wolverine's mind for the rest. I mean, he's not the same man in the sense that no one is the same person they are now as they were in 1973, if you happen to be alive in 1973, but the experiences of this new changed Xavier have helped mold this one. He's not the same guy he was in the post-apocalyptic future version of this very year, even though he's played by Patrick Stewart. That Xavier and Iceman and Storm and Kitty Pryde, etc., all lived and died, and their actions inform the direction the narrative takes moving forward, but in the past. Abrams' Star Trek has that too with Spock Prime. Regardless of how well it keeps pre-Nero continuity intact, it's a sequel that takes place in the past, not a prequel, and everything still happened, as Nero says, from his and Spock's perspective. But X-Men handles it in a more sophisticated way because I already know and care about both casts of characters, and also because the time travel itself is used as the thematic crux of the piece, the device that allows Xavier and Mystique a second chance and to recognize that people always have a choice to change for the better. Peaceful coexistence or total annihilation of one species or the other isn't inevitable. It's an ongoing series of the choices of individuals. And that's the point of the destiny versus free will theme here. It's not a question of which wins out in reality in the world we live in, but a conceit to make the optimistic point that everyone has a choice and it's never too late to make the right one. Wolverine serves as sort of a Spock Prime for Xavier in the past here, the older and wiser man who has to put him on the path to become the man he knows him to be. In Star Trek, Spock is trying to help Kirk put things back as close as possible to the future he knows, because history has been altered, and this Kirk and Spock are, quite literally, at each other's throats. unless he actually went back in time and to another dimension, but that's neither here nor there. This is a somewhat unusual time travel story in that Wolverine is intentionally trying to change his own past, rather than to preserve his timeline. There are a lot of time travel stories, especially in Star Trek, I just can't get away from that in this particular review, where we either go to an alternate future that has to be prevented, or someone from a horrible future comes back to what we think of as the present and proper timeline to change things and avoid some sort of apocalypse. Or in the case of the finale of Voyager, it's just Janeway selfishly trying to save her own dead friends, even though things are more or less pretty hunky-dory in the future she comes from. But it's usually just an alternate possible future, rather than one we've been working toward through several adventures. Here, the X-Men continuity we followed up through the Wolverine is treated as the undesirable but novel alternate future, and this earlier period is now sort of the present and proper timeline. It's all a matter of perspective, and again, I think X-Men 1 to 3 into First Class are now sort of telling one ongoing but loopy story that has a flashback interlude we need to get our bearings for this film. But rather than paving over what we had before, it watches like we're now creating the right timeline, because if we didn't change it, humanity and mutant kind would be doomed. So this would be like if, in the Days of Future Past comics, Kitty Pryde went back to before the period you've been reading, and you had to read an alternate version of all those stories until you caught back up to X-Men 141. We've essentially watched a lot of movies in an alternate timeline, and now we're finally watching the proper one. Sort of. Now, that's not to suggest that only one of these histories matters, so there's no reason to go back and watch the old movies, or at least the first two. Continuity gets really dicey after that. Again, because it's our characters' actions that set these things in motion from the beginning, and it's Xavier and Magneto who have to rectify decisions they made that create the dystopia, what could have looked like just an excuse to move forward without future continuity weighing Singer down, or whoever might make more of these in the future, becomes fresh, compelling storytelling. That's, of course, to say nothing about the missed opportunities I think abound in X-Men Apocalypse, since we've already had a movie now that continues from here into what should be a really exciting open frontier. Well, that and Deadpool, where Colossus has somehow become a lot bigger and gained a Russian accent after the changes in the timeline. But wait a minute, in the no future Wolverine snaps back to, the previous version of Colossus is a teacher at Xavier's school. Wow, Xavier's right. The future never is truly set. I guess the timeline Wolverine's in there got wiped out already, somehow, by 2016, and retroactively that's just a happy fan service future and it doesn't really count. Singer has as much as said so in interviews. Deadpool was right, these alternate timelines are confusing. Maybe these movies were always going to keep taking creative licenses they always have, and this wasn't the X-Men cinematic universe finally sobering up and giving overall continuity consistency the old college try. I guess the soft reboot isn't about making things make sense so much as it is about making an easy excuse to pave over the old timeline so we can use younger versions of characters like Scott and Jean, and just hope nobody notices or cares when the movies contradict stuff that's still in canon or wouldn't have been changed by this reboot. So by Apocalypse, this whole thing starts to look a lot like Star Trek 09. Now that I've seen Apocalypse, it's hard not to think Days of Future Past would have been the perfect movie to put this whole franchise to bed with. But of course, it wouldn't have been executed the way it was and with those great send-offs to the earlier cast if it was envisioned as a finale in the first place. I'll get to Apocalypse down the line, but I'll just say now that I don't hate that movie, but I found it really disappointing after the exciting clean slate this one created, and it's a testament to how much this movie resonated with me that Apocalypse's missteps don't affect my continual enjoyment of it too much, except for maybe that cliffhanger about Wolverine, Mystique, and Weapon X. And a lot of that is because it's made with the heart and the fervor you'd expect from a production team doing a last hurrah movie and trying to go out on a high note, even though Singer and his team knows they're going to rush another one out just 2 years later. The time travel conceit here is a good ticking time bomb that creates a perpetual sense of urgency and a cool contrivance to allow the X-Men of the future to remain in the film from beginning to end. The exposition dump scene toward the beginning is hurried, and a lot of the rules of the time travel are preposterous, but time travel is always a conceit that requires a set of arbitrary and less than entirely scientific guidelines, and luckily this one isn't so caught up in that pseudoscience that the story gets lost. Time travel is exactly exactly like magic. I can only suspend my disbelief if there's a consistent set of rules, and the story is only engaging if the time travel doesn't make our protagonist all-powerful. This time travel is simple. It's very limited. There's only one chance at getting it right, especially once Kitty gets stabbed by Wolverine claws, and it instantly eliminates questions of butterfly effect and paradox. I was really surprised when I learned that time travel would be handled like it was in the comics, that someone's consciousness gets sent back rather than his body, because that's the sort of thing I'd expect some producer to insist must be done the more familiar way, or audiences will be confused. By opening a sort of psychic doorway between time periods that keep both running simultaneously, there's a looming uncertainty throughout the film as we periodically return to the future. What if Wolverine's actions in the past don't change anything? What if time can't be changed in any significant way? Or what if he makes things even worse, as begins to happen when Xavier starts to think Magneto was right about humanity all along? The main action happens in 1973, and our new futuristic X-Men get little character definition or a whole lot to do apart from fighting Sentinels, because this is Xavier's story, not theirs. Unlike The Last Stand, I wasn't too frustrated not to get to know them better. It makes sense there would be some unfamiliar X-Men working with Bobby and Kitty, etc., and there's perhaps an implication at the end that Bishop, Sunspot, Arclight, and Blink might not even exist in the rebooted timeline. An argument could be made that it would be nice to flesh them out so we care about their sacrifices as much as our mainstay characters. Even greater sacrifices if any of them are giving up their very existence, perhaps their souls if there's such a thing. But I appreciate Singer for not losing sight of the story he's telling by paying lip service to characterization when he doesn't have the canvas to really draw them properly. The device of two disparate time periods is great because it keeps the ball on Xavier's court. Once he knows about the future, Wolverine could snap back at any time. There's always the possibility that Xavier rediscovers his confidence and becomes the leader he needs to be to convince Mystique not to kill Trask. I love Wolverine as the time traveler for a bazillion reasons. I like the role reversal, where he's thrown in the unlikely mentor role for Xavier and has to teach the man who helped him what he learned. It's an almost literal interpretation of Superman's the son becomes the father and the father becomes the son. I like how it cleverly utilizes Hugh Jackman, the one actor who can believably look the same in the past because, as Kitty Pryde says, he doesn't age. Odd that he has graying hair in the future given that line, and given that no more than a decade has passed since we last saw him in the Wolverine. But I guess seeing most of your friends murdered over a short period of time would cause a lot of premature aging. And I love the original history ultimately living on through Wolverine, a man who once lost his entire history. He now has a new sort of amnesia, not remembering the last 50 years because he didn't experience them. It's a great irony that Wolverine's big sacrifice in saving the future is not getting to be a part of it, or at least not getting to remember the part he played. Almost a second Weapon X, except he remembers the previous timeline, he just doesn't know about the one he helped create. And this time, that sacrifice is not to become a victim and then a monster, but a hero. But I do question the idea that Wolverine's consciousness can make the trip over anyone else's because of his healing factor. Sure, it's part of the conceit. There's gotta be some reason that only Wolverine can go back. And I like that we don't dwell on it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense with what's come before, and at the very least, there's no reason Wolverine should be so sure it will work. His healing factor has always exclusively been a physical thing. Why is he so confident it will protect his consciousness? Especially since it didn't protect his memory when he went through the Weapon X program. That means perhaps that it regrows brain tissue, but it starts from scratch, like resetting a computer back to factory specs. If attempting to go back in time that far would leave a normal person a vegetable, how does Wolverine know it won't just, at the very least, give him total amnesia when he gets to the past? The other thing I have to question about the time travel is what in the world quantum consciousness leaping has to do with walking through walls. And yes, that's what I've decided that power is called. Quantum consciousness leaping. I've trademarked it and I want a quarter every time somebody says it. There are other mutants with multiple powers, but there's usually some correlation between them. Jean Grey has telepathy and telekinesis, both are mind powers. Wolverine has healing factor in his claws, and before Origin of the comics, it was typically assumed the claws weren't natural. And that was the case in this continuity too, prior to Origins. Stryker says in X2 that he gave Wolverine his claws, but even the natural claws work in tandem with the healing factor. He needs it to heal his hands whenever the claws protrude through his skin. Kitty Pryde can walk through stuff and send people's minds back into their own bodies earlier in time. Maybe it's like walking through walls because their consciousnesses are going through the time barrier. Heck, it would almost be easier to buy that as a power Xavier suddenly discovers later in life. It sounds like a telepathic ability. Again, in the comics, it's Kitty's consciousness that gets sent back in time, but of course, there is no Kitty Pryde in this 1973, so this is a way to get her in there, and also to utilize as much of what actually worked in X-Men 3 as possible. But it's jarring because it's so random. On first viewing, I thought there had to be some kind of technology at work, like there was some mechanism in the table she uses. Nope. It's just a plot device power. And I can't help but wonder, if you don't already have mind powers, how would you ever figure out you could do such a thing? Just imagine if she had that ability all along and mutants went totally extinct because she never discovered it. And the first time she did realize she could do that, whoever she sent back in time would likely alter things enough that she wouldn't remember sending them back, and she still wouldn't know she could do that. Bishop, or whoever she sent back, would have to come from the future and tell her she has that ability. If the only person who remembers the alternate timeline is the person she sends back, then she wouldn't even remember doing it and would have to go on word of mouth every time. When she tells Wolverine she can send someone back a day, maybe a week, that can't come from personal experience, can it? I think she would remember Bishop telling her she sent him back in time, but not actually doing it. And she must have figured out she could do that pretty late in the game, considering how many X-Men they've lost, unless most of those were with Professor X and Magneto's group. Come to think of it, I wonder why the two groups didn't try to combine forces before now. Professor X has a Cerebro in his X-Jet. Did they just get that up and running? But if they were all together in the first place, there'd be no one not in the know to deliver time travel exposition to. And while we're at it, how are they getting enough fuel to run that plane? And where is Wolverine getting his cigars? These issues don't impact the story beyond the initial setup, but they're distracting to me because they don't seem to mesh with pre-established mythology. I wouldn't question these things if we had a character whose mutant power was, say, astral projection, and he used his powers in conjunction with some other mutant who could send consciousnesses back in time, and maybe her powers protected her from the changes in the timeline, so she remembered using her abilities. I don't know, but it has to be Wolverine and it has to be Kitty Pryde, so we have throwaway explanations that fall apart under scrutiny. There are also a number of questions I can't help but ask about the time gap between The Last Stand and the future portions of this film that admittedly might be really hard to answer, and again, are pretty inconsequential to the story. On one hand, I'm glad we're not spending a lot of time on these things because that's not what the movie is about and it would bog down pacing. On the other hand, there are elephants in the room that make it hard to focus on the important stuff if you're a fan of this franchise, because like a lot of these movies, there's equal parts care and dismissal of previous continuity. It's awkward because if you look at this as only the second X-Men movie, as just a sequel to First Class, and ignore the others, the future stuff works just fine. How those characters get together, or why any of them look the way they do, or why certain characters are alive but others are dead, doesn't make an adamantium bullet's difference. But if you look at this as an ongoing story that goes back in the past and then continues, it's hard not to want those answers, and it's kind of fun to look at the crazy mess we've made in just a few movies. I could almost make the argument that leaving complicated questions unanswered is the movie's proof that this universe desperately needs an overhaul. So I'll just list some things here that I'd love to know that the movie never explains. Feel free to skip ahead if this stuff bores you, and a lot of these aren't necessarily continuity mistakes or retcons. There's some time between when we last saw the original X-Men characters and the Sentinel-rated future, so anything's possible. And X-Men is, at its core, an overly complicated soap opera anyway. At the very least, we're nailing that. Number 1, how did Professor Xavier get his body back? Or if the mutant whose consciousness he transferred his body into in the after-credit scene in X3 is his twin, which is the prevailing theory, why is he still paralyzed in exactly the same way? This one is especially troubling on first viewing because the after-credit scene in The Wolverine teases an explanation. Logan seems absolutely bewildered to see Xavier still alive when he and Eric come to see Wolverine at the airport. He says, "How is this possible?" And Xavier says, "As I told you once before, you're not the only one with gifts." That seems to imply that there's a power that explains how Professor X, paralyzed and in a wheelchair, is here. I think that's the main reason fans expected Days of Future Past to pour some concrete into a lot of plot holes before it totally repaved the road. And if it weren't for that, I might not have been nearly as preoccupied by the lack of explanation. Number 2, how did Wolverine get his adamantium claws back? He lost them during the events of the Wolverine, but has them again in the future. They seem to look deliberately different, suggesting there was some thought about that continuity at the production level. In an interview to Empire magazine, Singer suggests that perhaps Magneto reconstituted them for him, which is a perfectly sensible reason, but it's not in the movie. It would have been neat if that explanation was worked into the dialogue, because it would add an extra layer to Magneto's line as they're boarding the airplane in the past when he says, "Imagine if they were metal," which would make that an unconscious reference both to Wolverine's early and later relationships with Magneto. Number 3, speaking of Wolverine, when did he get his pre-Weapon X memories back? This is also a bit of an issue in the Wolverine, so I don't know if we can chalk that up to yet some other event in the years that followed we aren't privy to. But Wolverine's consciousness is sent back to his pre-amnesiac self, yet he recognizes the girl he wakes up in bed with and tells the men who walk in the room that he slept with her several times. That's a pretty insignificant detail about his previous life, so it sure seems like he got his entire memory back. I don't know, maybe House of M happens in there somewhere. I also used to be fuzzy on just how much time passed from when Wolverine meets Xavier and Magneto at the airport in the stinger for the Wolverine, but if you pay close attention, it's actually made clear in the movie. I used to think that scene didn't match with the terrible future we have here, but looking at it again, I'm not sure what my issue even was with it. It's 2 years after the events of the Wolverine. Logan's in an airport, no idea where he's going or what he's been doing those 2 years, but whatever. Magneto tells him there are dark forces that threaten mutant existence, and we see the Trask logo. So that company is developing Sentinels. Somehow Magneto and Xavier know about it and have joined forces to stop it. They recruit Wolverine, but they're too late to stop the Sentinels from being created. They fail to defeat the Sentinels, and after a little under a decade, this scary nightmare future happens. Wolverine's even still with Xavier and Magneto after all this time when they meet the younger X-Men at the Hope Cathedral. Kitty Pryde has a line during the exposition dump where she says the last 50 years will have only happened for Wolverine, and that tells us exactly what year the future events take place in. Wolverine is sent back to 1973, which means it's 2023 at the start of the film. If we can assume that the movies prior to First Class all happened close to or in the year they were released, it's been about 15 years since the last time we saw older Xavier and Magneto, and now we have a clear X-Men timeline, when previously Origins and First Class are period pieces, but everything else happens in the not-too-distant future. It's weird going back to The Last Stand now, because we know more or less exactly what year that happens in. That's the trouble with taking X-Men back to the past. We're dealing with characters who get older and die, so we can't be ambiguous about time anymore. But I'm glad we're working to make the period stuff gel with the earlier movies. Weirder even than events that aren't explained between The Last Stand and this movie are those that happened in the original timeline between 1973 and the future, partly because they're questions Wolverine should be asking, just like he asked how Xavier being at the airport was possible, questions that might have gone a long way to ensuring his mission is a success. When Xavier tells Wolverine he didn't have his powers in 1973, Wolverine ought to ask why. It's more suspenseful and intriguing for the audience to learn that as we go, sure. And I appreciate that Logan doesn't have a lot of information we don't, at least about the past, so he's our eyes into the alien world of 1973, where everything about the X-Men we saw in First Class is different. I realize there's not a lot of time to waste, what with the Sentinels trying to find and kill them all, but if Wolverine had asked about it, and Xavier told him about the bleak mental state he was in, Wolverine might have asked him how he got through that the first time around, so maybe he'd have a strategy to help young Xavier get through it this time. Xavier struggled to find himself again is gripping, and it's more painful in this alternate timeline than it might have been the first time around, because once Xavier knows about the future, it sinks him into a much deeper state of self-doubt. Sure, he might be able to stop Raven from killing Trask and setting those catastrophic events in motion, but knowing what the humans would have done to Mystique, and knowing what they did do to most of his original X-Men team, plunges him into a despair he may never have crawled out of, if not for experiencing his older self's unyielding hope, in a future where most of them have been wiped out. And yet, in the original timeline, Xavier would still be addicted to the drug that gives him his legs but takes away his telepathy, and not having his powers makes it easier for him to shirk his responsibility and hide away from the world. He still blames himself for not being able to get through to Eric and for losing Raven, and he's already lost a lot of his optimism for society that takes his students and sends them to Vietnam. What hope, I imagine he'd be thinking, does mutant kind have for cohabitation with humans when they show such disregard for the lives of their own kind? The first time around, Xavier not only must have found his confidence again without Wolverine's aid, but he somehow developed a faith so strong it's still unshakable in a future where there are so few mutants left you could probably put them all in a movie together before fans started crying there were too many characters to keep up with. Again, it's not a plot hole or an incongruity, but I was really surprised to not get even a hint of how that happened originally. Here's another. How in the world does Mystique survive her capture in the original timeline when the experiments Trask did on her friends led to the demise of all of them? In this new timeline, in which Trask's murder has been prevented, he says he needs a lot more from her than just blood, including brain tissue and spinal fluid. The same sort of research, no doubt, that originally led to the creation of the Sentinels we see in the future that can adapt to any mutant power. Perhaps she escaped somehow the first time around, and perhaps her captors didn't get everything from her Trask asked for. And of course, she has powers that would have made that easier than any of her friends. And maybe that's why it takes so many decades to create the original Sentinels, but I wish I knew. I do really like the implication that the cold, hardened Mystique we see in the earlier movies is created by the trauma she goes through here. Her growing up with Charles and starting out as one of the original X-Men is a hard pill to swallow in first class, but this bit of history makes that a lot more believable and makes her a much more tragic and interesting character. It's still odd if Xavier has such a complicated history with her, especially if her leaving him caused him to spiral into a deep state of drug addiction and depression, that we never get any sense at all that he cares about Raven in the earlier movies. The reason, obviously, is because that was an afterthought. But I suppose it could be that in his mind, Mystique is a totally other person from the girl he knew in the 60s. And perhaps he'd also be really good at hiding those sorts of things from a later generation of students he needs to have a personal detachment from in order to properly mentor them. I'm also curious as to how Magneto got out of his prison in the basement of the Pentagon the first time around. Xavier and Magneto tell Wolverine where Magneto was being held in 1973, but apparently not why. How does Wolverine not ask McKellen's Magneto, how the heck did you get thrown into the basement of the Pentagon? The answer? Because it's more fun and dramatic to hear it from Beast and Xavier in the past. I love the idea that Magneto tried to save JFK and was instead implicated in his murder, especially because from the viral marketing, I thought the movie was going to make Magneto the shooter, and I thought that was really obvious, been there, done that territory. And so this was a really clever new spin on that. But there are a lot of inherent questions with that situation that are never addressed. Number one, how exactly did Eric know JFK was a mutant? It's a fantastic idea, but something the whole world was unaware of, and Eric has caused a rift between him and the one telepath he knows. So unless he's friends with someone else who can read minds or the future or whatnot that we don't know about, I'd like to know how he figured that out. Number two, what a missed opportunity. How do you tell us JFK was a mutant and not reveal what his ability was? I can't be the only person who was curious about that. And if there's no explanation about how Magneto knows he's a mutant, why not let him also know and talk about the power just because the audience is curious? The first time I saw it, I turned to a total stranger next to me in the theater and blurted out, "What's his power?" And the guy next to me said, "Politics!" Number three, so Lee Harvey Oswald, or whoever shot JFK in this version of events, takes his shot and Eric uses his powers and the bullet visibly curves, but he's unable to stop it from going through the president's brain. I appreciate that this isn't recreated in a flashback, especially because flashbacks get doubly tedious and sometimes confusing in a movie where you're literally moving around through time, but that's a little hard to visualize. Does that mean that the shooter would have missed if Magneto hadn't intervened? Was the shooter aiming at some other body part? I'm no firearm or geometry expert, but if the bullet was headed toward the president's head and you diverted it anywhere at all but down, wouldn't it likely miss the man entirely? I do love the callback to the bullet swerve later, and I wonder whether it was intentional or a happy accident, where Mystique jumps out the window and Magneto puts a bullet in her leg when it curves downward to follow after her. Number four, we've made Magneto part of the conspiracy in a really neat way, but I'm fuzzy on if the government covered up who they think really killed the president, Magneto, by implicating Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman. Maybe the idea that Oswald didn't act alone came from, in this universe, the fact that the government thinks Magneto did it. Even though the word implicated comes up referring to Magneto's role in the assassination, I have to assume it was publicly swept under the rug, or Eric Lenscher would be infamous from then on for killing JFK, which he obviously isn't, since Wolverine's surprised by it. Is that because the government doesn't want to start a panic about mutants? And if so, how classified is that data? Congress doesn't seem to know anything about it. And speaking of plastic prisons, Days of Future Past is an excellent example of repeating and homaging scenes from previous installments in a franchise without just ripping yourself off, relying entirely on nostalgia, or looking like you're out of ideas. That's a line The Force Awakens walks to varying degrees of success. I think Singer keeps his balance across that tightrope pretty gracefully all the way through. It helps that the movie he's constantly calling back to, X2, isn't so universally beloved and memorized like the original Star Wars, although it's generally well-liked. It turns into a real problem with X-Men Apocalypse, but here, it's sometimes so subtle I didn't even pick up on it until later viewings. And often, it's something that believably might happen during the events of X2 and in an altered past. The best thing that's recycled from X2 is John Ottman's brilliant fanfare, which gave me goosebumps the first time I saw this, and, laugh at me if you want to, totally brought tears to my eyes during the opening credits. X2 left a real impression on me. I was just graduating from high school when that came out, and a plethora of other profound changes were happening in my life right then. That's a movie about letting go of the past, taking what you've learned from it, and taking charge of your future. I bought that score right after I saw X2 the first time, and it became part of my life's soundtrack. So the opening credits for this movie took me right back to 2003. But more than that, set the tone with its new hard-edged undercurrent representing that dark but preventable future for a completely different movie that profoundly resonated with me in a whole other way, during another point in my life where it had something to say to me personally, and I'll get into that a little when I talk about Xavier's arc. Getting into story parallels, the plot here once again sees Magneto being busted out of a plastic prison, working with Xavier's team toward a common goal until their interests deviate and he goes off on his own, becoming as dangerous of a threat to the peace Xavier craves as the one he teamed up with the X-Men to stop. It's not rehash because this is what Magneto does. He stubbornly insists that he and Xavier want the same thing, but ultimately always votes for mutant supremacy with an impromptu master plan. And while we've seen this before, from Eric's perspective, it's the first time, and his motivations leading up to that are well developed. The humans have proven, for him, that it's always going to be them or the mutants. The nightmare future Wolverine describes only serves to tell Magneto that he was right, and the only way to stop that from happening is for mutants to exert their might over humanity before the humans use their powers against them. That's another thing it has in common with X2, a human antagonist who wants to destroy mutant kind by using their abilities against them. Both movies include scenes that take place in the White House, and both see mutants who nearly assassinate a president, but for opposite reasons. And weirdly, one is trying to murder the former boss of the man who's mind-controlling the other, and one would-be assassin may or may not be the mother of the other. I like that the lawn of the White House becomes the setting for our denouement here. It watches like it's building on that choice as the site that would begin an all-out war between mutants and humans, rather than Singer repeating himself. The significance of that landmark in the context of a group of people fighting for their right to be treated as equals is as obvious as the Statue of Liberty in the first X-Men film. And here's a tiny one, but there's a tour guide taking a group through the Pentagon, just like the one showing the White House off at the beginning of X2. That one's just a random callback, though, as this lady isn't talking about anything more profound than dates and square footage. It doesn't factor into the story thematically the way the Lincoln quote does in X2. We have a similar Mystique breaking into a private military facility to steal secret files scene, and I really like this callback because it's the first glimpse of future Mystique we get, just as the dominoes are starting to fall that'll lead her to try to kill Trask and go down that path. I guess no matter what size she is, the tear ducts she transforms are still the same set of tear ducts. Oh, and there's also a scene where she seduces a government employee, shape-shifting into a human-looking version of herself, so the actress playing Mystique can be in those scenes. In X2, it's to get Magneto out of prison. Even though he escapes incarceration here too, she's not involved with that this time. She seduces a man for information here so she can find and kill Trask. In both instances, though, what she's doing has something to do with foiling a plot involving William Stryker. And Wolverine, as always, is queasy on airplanes, but that's not just an X2 thing, because Wolverine gets on a plane in every movie he doesn't just have a cameo in. I also love that Magneto finds a way to control Wolverine with metal, even when he has none in his body. His throwing Wolverine across the lawn and into the river calls back to his launching Wolverine through the woods in The Last Stand, but he's constantly manipulating Wolverine's animanium, and this doesn't strike me as just a cute, out-of-character nod to that. Knowing about Wolverine's healing factor, I totally buy this Magneto would do that, even not knowing his future counterpart does the same because the skeleton is covered in metal. It also reminds me of Magneto's "you think it's always about you" from the previous movies. He doesn't say that, but that idea is implied when Wolverine, the man sent back to make sure the future is saved, is taken out of play, because this really isn't about him. One of the main criticisms of the initial run of X-Men movies is that they're always about Wolverine. We did a Geeks Not Nerds episode well before First Class was released, discussing whether or not the X-Men films could be successful without Wolverine.
If there had never been anything, if there had never been Wolverine, if Wolverine never existed, that's what I was trying to say. Then I think the X-Men films would have still done just fine because they were popular early on, back in the 60s and 70s when there was no Wolverine, so I think they would have done just fine. I think as long as you've got Professor X and Magneto in an X-Men film, you've got the makings of a good story.
Times have certainly changed. The discussion I hear a lot now is whether Wolverine really needs to be in these movies at all. And sometimes, even if he's not integral to the plot, could we please not shove in a cameo? Wolverine is the most logical person to travel back in time with the consciousness displacement method, but singer and co-writer Matthew Vaughn are smart in realizing that that doesn't mean the story should be about him. Rather than pulling a "these are the voyages" from Star Trek Enterprise and shafting our new main cast for familiar and beloved old faces, Wolverine becomes, first, the eyes into the past for the audience, and then the pupil that has to remind the mentor who he is again. Wolverine is kept wonderfully in character, fully admitting he's not intellectually or emotionally the right guy for this job. So rather than an excuse to put Wolverine front and center again, his inclusion ups the stakes. That choice is a liability. If Xavier could have gone back, the whole thing would be easy. He'd know almost exactly what to say to Raven and Eric, although his 1973 self would still be broken, and I guess he'd just have to hope he didn't change the timeline so much that whatever brought him out of the funk the first time around does it again. We'd also have a James McAvoy that would have to do a Patrick Stewart impression. I like that while he's learned a lot from Xavier and he's a whole person now, Wolverine is still Wolverine. He can work with a team, but he's still a natural loner, and as he says, patience isn't his strong suit. He's a man of action when what Xavier needs is a man with the right words. But while Wolverine is Xavier's unlikely guide who needs no character arc, he's not just there. He easily could have given Xavier his message from the future and then just stood around the rest of the movie hoping it would all work out, but he's integral to the story. While your average wise sage from the future or the ether or wherever cryptically points the protagonist in the right general direction, Wolverine has ideas and does stuff. It's his idea to use Quicksilver to break into the Pentagon. It's his idea to have Xavier mind meld with him so he can talk to Patrick Stewart and be motivated, like anyone would, by the fact that if he plays his cards right, he gets to grow up and turn into that guy. And until the last act, I buy that Kitty Pryde needs to keep the time rift open so he can see it all through. Otherwise, that ticking time bomb in the future is kind of meaningless. You want obstacles to get in the way of your hero succeeding, especially here, when future Xavier is staring into an abyss that keeps getting more abyssy. Let's go with abysmal. Like when Wolverine accidentally slashes Kitty Pryde and she has to keep the link going while suffering a bunch of blood loss. And at the end, when the Sky Coffins find the Hope Cathedral and they're all done for. Singer masterfully uses Wolverine's presence to build tension without letting him take over the story, while simultaneously giving him another satisfying journey that serves to send off some of the original cast, appropriate since Wolverine was the main character of those movies. It's ironic and impressive that a story with this many characters, including different versions of different characters, is at its core a story about one man's internal struggle. As Mary Poppins might say, Xavier gets in his own way. His is a crisis of faith, identity, and self-worth. He's able to help people because he believes in them. The more he recedes into himself, the more he loses touch with people, and so the more he loses touch with himself. Xavier begins to get cut off with his own humanity the longer he cuts himself off from people telepathically. The trade-off of his powers for his legs is a classic movie conceit. He must pay for what he wants by losing what he needs, ultimately learning to accept that he can't have everything he wants for the satisfaction of being the better man. The side effect of Hank's drug curing Xavier's paralysis while nullifying his mutant powers is convenient and begs the question as to whether Hank might have accidentally stumbled upon the universal cure for paralysis and maybe every other ailment there is. Though there's no telling whether the stuff would cure his paralysis if he wasn't a mutant. But it's a fantastic illustration of his internal conflict. He can ignore his gift and his self-given purpose by pretending to not be a mutant at all. To literally give up his powers and pretend to be whole by walking around on the legs he lost while standing up against his best friend for what he believed in. If he doesn't take the drug, he has to publicly showcase the terrible price he paid for his belief that mutants and humans can live together in harmony. Now, that incredible power, that control, comes with a handicap. And like Mystique and Beast, he can't so easily hide his mutation. I've always loved the idea that arguably the most powerful man alive, who can control a multitude of minds with a thought, is lacking that basic motor control. And the fact that he gave it up to fight for his dream, and now he has to choose between living a regular life and sacrificing his own comfort to realize that dream, makes me appreciate the ending of First Class even more. And Xavier isn't shallow about it. He doesn't take the drug because he hates not being able to walk. He takes it as he struggles to say to Magneto, so he can sleep. He's a conflicted, wavering man, and without that certainty and conviction he had when he first met Eric, the voices in his head become a terrifying cacophony that no longer sound like the potential, eventual symphony they once did. I love his line to Wolverine about where his powers come from. First he points to his mind, then to his heart. This is impressively not sappy. He needs confidence in himself first, and then confidence in the people he's trying to help, that they have what it takes, just as he knows he does, to make the right decisions for themselves. He also says in that scene that he feels like one of his students, because he feels lost and out of control. I love watching him fall to rock bottom and having to learn the same lesson he teaches his students, because it's a real one that most of us have to repeatedly learn throughout our lifetimes. You have to help yourself before you can help others. That's part of the basic metaphor of the X-Men. Taming mutant powers is like taming emotion. A mutant can't help but be what he is and do what he does, and he should use his powers just as we should all allow ourselves to feel what we feel, to use our emotions. But he shouldn't be ruled by his powers, and we shouldn't be ruled by our emotions. Once we know how to control those things, we can help other people who are overwhelmed by theirs to do the same. It's one of the better believe in yourself messages I've seen in movies. So often that feels like an empty platitude, a hollow greeting card sentiment. Xavier's arc is a great metaphor for the artist who worries his best work is behind him. That's where the movie resonated most for me. It's so easy sometimes to look at your past, to compare the you today to the you from yesterday, and to be intimidated by that person. I felt that way a little bit when I was working on Spawn here. The whole world seemed against Xavier after the Cuban Missile Crisis. His best friend didn't believe in his cause and took a lot of his X-Men with him. The Vietnam War took his students after the first semester, and with only Hank left, a mutant who wants more than anything to hide what he is, and might sooner eradicate mutation than look for peaceful cohabitation with humans, he finds he has no purpose and gives up. And once Wolverine comes back in time, and he slowly starts to rediscover his purpose, he starts to wonder if he's the same man with the same gift. Mutant powers are the same as God-given talents. Even if you're naturally great at something, you need the passion, the willpower, and the drive to wield them properly. That's why we can marvel at and be inspired by characters like Superman. It isn't just that these characters have amazing powers bestowed upon them and they have really easy lives because of it. It's what they do with them. And here, Xavier illustrates how difficult it can be to find the attitude and the determination to use your talents to the fullest, like a burnout writer who's forgotten why he writes. And even once you rediscover yourself, it can be easy to measure yourself up to the you before you had that existential crisis. Xavier gets so used to taking the easy way out, he struggles at every stage to become Professor Xavier again. From the man who insisted there is no professor here, to something more reminiscent of the elderly man in the monastery in the future. The moment that personally hits me hardest is when Wolverine tells Xavier to find and train the X-Men, and Xavier says, "I'll do my best," really timidly. And Wolverine responds with, "Your best is enough. Trust me." That's perhaps the very last moment that Wolverine's presence in the past is absolutely necessary. I think if he snaps back then, the future might be fine, except for perhaps alleviating Hank's fear of the unknown, worried that his fate is sealed regardless of Xavier's belief in humanity over quantum theory, when Logan amusingly and insensitively tells Hank he doesn't live in the future but that they can change that. I love Jackman's line delivery there, by the way. I love that future Xavier doesn't tell past Xavier exactly what he needs to hear, and presto, he's perfect. He still has a lot of healing to do, and that healing is painful. And this is a protagonist with many opportunities for change. He has a major one he has to take beyond quitting the drug and listening to a stirring Patrick Stewart speech. Once he gets his control back, he has to learn when to let go and allow a person to make decisions for herself, just like the ones he's been making. Patrick Stewart's Xavier spells out the film's message with his line to his counterpart: just because someone stumbles, loses their way, doesn't mean they're lost forever. Young Xavier repeats that line again in reference to Raven when Hank proposes the fixed timeline theory, that perhaps Raven will just go on trying to kill Trask and the future will more or less work itself out the way it did before Wolverine interfered because the future is set. If Xavier is going to believe in people again, he has to believe in their ability to choose, and so he chooses not to believe that theory. Now sure, he could be wrong, but he's seen a future where he and Eric learn to work together despite their differences in the face of Armageddon. Although honestly, that's a really desperate situation. It's hard to tell just how much Magneto has really changed. It certainly seems that people have the ability to go against their personal natures and be whatever they want to be. I usually resist putting a lesson in a simple quote you could print on a t-shirt because A, it's usually forced and I can see the writer lecturing through characters on the screen, and B, I feel cheated when a story's characters are boiled down to nothing more than mouthpieces for a moral. But in this case, it feels like Xavier himself is learning something for himself and then reaffirming it when he sees that Raven has to go on the same journey he just did. It's not the movie telling us what we're supposed to have gotten out of it that it maybe didn't make clear enough in its narrative, like the end of Darkman or Constantine. It's a man literally giving himself advice and then passing that advice on to someone else. And sure, now the film's message is gift-wrapped for us and dropped down the chimney on Christmas morning. There's no hidden meaning there, but it works for me because I believe everything Xavier goes through to learn it. It's like the power-responsibility message in The Amazing Spider-Man. There's understanding the fortune cookie intellectually, and then there's really learning it through life experience. Like so many superhero movies, especially recent ones, the theme of hope versus fear is at the center of our hero's journey. Xavier thinks it's everyone else's pain he's afraid of, but it's really his own. If he can face his own fears, he can help others to face theirs. Future Xavier tells him he must do this by finding hope in humanity again, and interestingly, he says the X-Men need him to hope again, which is maybe a line that can be read in two ways. We need you to hope again, just as it sounds. We need you to find hope again, or we need you to hope again, as in we need you, comma, so that we can find hope again. Xavier must become the personification of the idea he hopes to perpetuate, that stubborn optimism that never fades no matter how bad things get. There's that idea in The Dark Knight Rises about false hope, the denial that prevents a person from accepting reality and moving on. But here, Xavier manages to find that hope because he himself, in the future, was able to keep it alive. It's not unrealistic or naive because it's all a matter of choice. We make our own fate, and so long as there are any of us left at all, we have the capacity to make a better world. I love future Xavier's description of hope as the most human part. Unlike Magneto and Trask, he doesn't define humans and mutants as separate species, and that's really the key to his philosophy. Mutants and humans can coexist because they're all really human at the core, all subject to the human condition. The war between humans and mutants is really no different from Vietnam, a pointless bloodbath that sees people making excuses to treat other people as less than human. Even if mutation really is the next step in human evolution, Xavier doesn't think that means one side must wipe out the other, because what both humans and mutants have over any other species in the process of natural selection is reason and free will. We can live together peacefully because we have the choice to do so. Or if somehow natural selection leads to the extinction of humankind in favor of mutant kind, like mutants will somehow all have an evolutionary trait humans are lacking that allows them to survive the next extinction level event, there's at least no reason we have to help it along or artificially force that inevitability. And I liked it in the apocalyptic future we see here that seems to lead to the near extinction of both races. Humanity itself is given the same opportunity for change here that our lead characters have. We all make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we can't come back from them, and that's maybe true of our civilization en masse. Xavier and Raven both choose to be the better X-Men, and that gives humanity itself the chance to change. But this is a story about individuals, and only time will tell if mankind itself will ultimately take that same opportunity. Trask, of course, sees things differently. He doesn't think humanity can find common ground without a common enemy, so he spins mutants as the next step in evolution that humans must band together to defeat in order to survive. He's not like Magneto or even the Stryker from X2. He believes in unity before he believes in the kill or be killed mentality those men share. He wants to wipe out an entire race, but not because he's afraid of them. As he says to Stryker, he doesn't hate mutants, he quite admires them. But he's an opportunist, and he sees them as a force he can exploit for what he sees as the greater good. He's the perfect foil for Xavier. He's not the human version of Magneto, as Stryker was, nor is he exactly a human version of Xavier, but he is similar in that he's after peace. He just doesn't care about having it with mutants. His isn't so much a philosophy or an ideology, but a strategy. I don't think Trask really sees mutants as another species, or even necessarily as a threat to human survival, but he chooses to label them as such, and discuss them as if they're less than human, even though he likens them to Homo sapiens when we beat out the Neanderthal on the evolutionary ladder, in order to justify mutant eradication, not to himself necessarily, but to satisfy the conscience of the masses. The Trask is something of a mystery. We know little of his background or why he's become so passionate about trying to unite humanity against the mutants, and it would be kind of inaccurate to call him a sympathetic antagonist because I know so little about him, and perhaps if we knew too much, it would seem heavy-handed. I love Peter Dinklage's casting, not just because he gives a good performance, but because he portrays Trask as this diminutive man who doesn't look the least bit menacing, but has aspirations of genocide, emphasizing the power of the mind over physical might, especially during an era of huge technological strides. Unlike Xavier, Trask is a man who seems to care deeply about his own image and legacy. He wants to see himself as a giant. Perhaps he was bullied or abused as a child on account of his size, and he wants to prove that intellect trumps physical stature. Maybe it means a lot to him that someone who is quite the opposite of the model of genetic superiority saved the human race from the perceived coming of its evolutionary better. But we're not told that, and I really like that he's simply a tiny man building giant robots, and no attention is ever brought to that fact in the dialogue. Without that scene where he reveals his perspective on mutants to Stryker, he'd be just another mad government employee out to kill what he doesn't understand. And that's what Stryker is unfortunately kind of relegated to here. I find it really unlikely that this guy would ever send his mutant kid to Xavier's school. I'm also more and more starting to think that he developed a southern accent later in life. But Trask seems to see himself as a necessary evil, a realist with a twisted sort of optimism that fuels his ambition. Xavier wants peace between humans and mutants, but he's skipping a major step that Trask acknowledges. How can you expect peace between two races when you don't even have it with one? Charles struggles to maintain his beliefs as if they were part of a religious faith, and Trask does something kinda similar. He believes humanity needs a common enemy as strongly as Xavier believes they can live together peacefully. The difference between them is that Xavier really does think humans and mutants are more the same than they are different, and Trask has to pretend that's not the case, to ignore his own sense of empathy in order to experiment on mutants as if they were lab animals. He and Xavier are opposite sides of the coin, much like Magneto and Shaw were last movie. Xavier tries to save humanity by demonstrating his own, while Trask tries to save it by sacrificing his own. And the really sad and perverse thing is, by the end of the movie, Xavier and Trask, who are sometimes in the same location but never exchange words, almost seem to have more in common than Xavier and Magneto do. Trask doesn't want to destroy mutants out of revenge or a sense of superiority, but simply because he thinks it will unite his people, who have sometimes had reason to think it really is us or them. In fact, without people like Magneto, you couldn't have Trask. At the beginning of the movie, he's trying to convince Congress that mutants are a threat at all. And of course, Magneto tries to help Trask make his point by single-handedly declaring war on humanity before Mystique takes him out. I've been focusing a lot on Xavier as the singular protagonist, but it would be disingenuous to ignore that this is a protagonist triad as it was in First Class. Xavier is certainly the hero of the piece, and while Mystique and Magneto both serve his character arc, they each have one of their own as well. And Magneto and Xavier's very different kinds of affection for Mystique makes this interestingly kind of a love triangle. Magneto continues as the tragic protagonist who refuses to change. Yes, he's sometimes an antagonist for Xavier, but it's more complicated than that. Unlike Trask, he is still a fully sympathetic bad guy, and one who is totally in touch with his convictions all the way through, unlike Xavier. As I mentioned earlier, it's chilling how close he comes to bringing Xavier to his side here. He so often seems to have a real point, and I find myself beginning to side with him, like during his "You abandoned us all" speech to Xavier on the plane. He thinks the reason mutants all get giant M's branded on their faces and become target practice for the Sentinels is because Mystique didn't go far enough, not because she did the wrong thing by trying to kill Trask. Killing one man isn't enough, he says. It never was for you, she shoots back. So he tries to do what he did, or will do, or now would have done in the third act of X2, kill all the humans. Or at least that's probably where he's eventually headed. Mystique is the physical embodiment of Xavier and Magneto's philosophical argument. She has now loved in different ways and been mentored by these two men with fundamentally different views on humanity. They're both to blame for her identity crisis, and to some degree, her attempt on Trask's life, a decision that becomes a lot harder once Xavier gets to weigh in the second time around the timeline bend. In First Class, she learned to be herself, not to hide and not to care about what other people think of her. And she tried to go her own way, to get out from under Xavier's influence, who she was molded by. Her powers somewhat reflected her personality and her internal conflict there. She could be anyone she wanted, but she struggled to find her own identity. That's taken to its furthest conclusion here. She traded one man with his own vision for her for another. And now that she's gotten away from them both, she can't decide what kind of person she wants to be. She's filled with rage for the death of her friends, but Magneto takes his hatred for humanity too far. She's a midpoint between the two at the beginning of the film and doesn't realize that killing Trask will take her much further in Magneto's direction than she wants to go. While I still question the story logic of the explanation she gives for it in First Class, I think this is the best the nude Mystique choice has ever played thematically. Raven is a woman who chooses to completely expose herself physically when she doesn't have a strategic reason to hide, and yet has no idea who she really is. She and Magneto both serve Xavier's arc without being relegated to simple plot devices, and their own progression naturally continues from what's done with them last film, even though there's a whole decade in between. Another character who easily could have just been a lame story device is Quicksilver, who Wolverine brings in to accomplish something that has to happen to move the story along, busting Magneto out of prison. But Singer takes full advantage of him for the few scenes he's in the film, and not just for comic relief. Quicksilver represents the lost and confused mutants who need Xavier's help, and who he's not there for as he's wallowing in his own pain. Peter is a directionless kid who's constantly stealing things because he can, and needs guidance because his father isn't there and his mother doesn't know what to do with him. Quicksilver is a fantastic choice for this role because his father just happens to be the guy who set Xavier on a self-destructive path and made him question the beliefs that led to creating the school in the first place. While Mystique left a positive role model for Peter's human-hating father, Peter should have been mentored by Xavier, and he perhaps drives home for Xavier the importance of the work he was doing before he quit, although Xavier isn't yet aware of Peter's parentage. Quicksilver is also a great choice because he provides a lot of opportunities to showcase the technology and pop culture of the time, and his speed reflects the increasingly more fast-paced world of the 70s versus the 60s. He easily could have, if you'll pardon the pun, sped in and out of the film without all the care taken in developing his unique personality and quirky sense of style. Not to mention the creative way we get to see the world from his eyes. Originally, his role in the story was meant to be Juggernaut's, and once Singer realized both Marvel and Fox had the rights to develop that character, he seemed to get really excited about the possibilities of using Quicksilver and was careful not to squander the opportunity. As nice as it might have been to flesh Juggernaut out and make him more than just the joke he was in X3, and as interesting as it might have been to use Xavier's brother to somehow help him find himself again, I'm really glad things turned out the way they did, because Quicksilver is just inspired here. He's one of the most memorable elements in the film. He made super speed new and fun and thrilling again just before Flash did it on TV. He is fantastic comic relief tempered with some subtle characterization that makes me feel for him at the same time as I'm laughing with him, and he's a new textbook example of how to create a fully realized character with minimal screen time. If I wanted to make a video just about Quicksilver, I'd wager a Pong machine that I'd have more to say about his role in just this movie than I would about Scott Summers in the entire original X-Men trilogy. And again, we didn't do that with every minor character here, and I'm not saying that we possibly could have, but Quicksilver is obviously a character Singer wanted to introduce and then bring back later, and he's impressively not just a placeholder. I also really like the quick shot of him watching the television in horror as his father declares war on the entire human race. There's so much going on in just his shocked expression in those few seconds. Oh my god, that's my father. Oh my god, I'm partly responsible because I helped break him out of the Pentagon. Oh my god, a minute ago this was all a game and now it's real. Oh my god, my dad hates Mountain Dew. But I love Mountain Dew. Don't say it, Dad. Don't say it. No more Mountain Dew. Finally, I'll close this behemoth with a mini review of the Rogue cut. I'm glad Fox allowed Singer to finish all the special effects for that version and that it was released on video. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch, and it's more than just an extended version. It's actually a different movie in the same way the Daredevil director's cut was. But it's not a director's cut, nor is it a superior cut, in my view, or the director's. This wasn't a case of necessary material being cut for time or a producer's vision clashing with the director's. It was simply an overall clunkier version with an unnecessary subplot in the future that really bogs down the pacing in the third act. I'm impressed with how seamless the reworking of scenes is in the theatrical cut. There are several things that are cut out, recut, or reshot to create a new cohesive story out of the old, and it doesn't feel hobbled together or out of place. The subplot involves a mission Xavier and Magneto go on to rescue Rogue from human scientists who have commandeered the X mansion and are experimenting on her so she can absorb Kitty Pryde's powers and take her place after Wolverine accidentally stabs Kitty. I like all kinds of things about this. It gives Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen more screen time, and it makes them the action heroes in the future at the same time as they're the main figures of the action in the past. I like the home motif this creates, paralleling the X-Mansion in the past and the future as the film does with some of its characters, and emphasizing how wrong things are in both time periods. The mansion represents Xavier's belief in humanity, and it must become the school for gifted youngsters again in the past if there's any hope for the future of mankind. But as Kitty Pryde holds the portal open between time periods, it's a mausoleum in the past and a perverted house of horrors in the future. I like the lip service the subplot serves to the love triangle in The Last Stand, which I really didn't like there, but I appreciate acknowledging, if only because it's an easy way for Rogue, Kitty, and Bobby to all still be sort of dealing with something from the past that was never really resolved. And in the Rogue cut, I appreciate the alternate peaceful future version of Bobby definitively winding up with Rogue because she's involved in this story and he clearly still has feelings for both. So while the alternate version of her in the mansion didn't technically go through all that, it's hard for my simple simian brain in the moment not to think, good for her, she deserves to be happy. And Bobby got his frozen head stepped on and shattered that one time. He deserves to be happy too. On the other hand, in the theatrical cut, Rogue coming out of nowhere at the end, and that couple getting to be together finally, a couple we started with all the way back with the first movie, is one of several great reveals for fans of the franchise and works just as well. But the intercutting between Magneto and the mansion and 1973 Magneto retrieving his helmet is drawn out, and they're not really linked together even thematically, so it feels out of place. And I find myself getting impatient spending too much time in the future, because while we periodically check in with our other set of X-Men, it's established as primarily the 1973 X-Men's movie, and the future functions mostly as a framing device. But the thread I think is even more in need of dropping is Mystique going to the mansion and sabotaging Cerebro. And that's where things just happen differently from the theatrical version rather than scenes just being lifted. In the theatrical cut, Mystique gets on a plane bound for Washington. Xavier tries to convince her to come home through the minds of various airport patrons. But she's determined, and he figures out where she's going through the eyes of one of the people he controlled who saw her ticket. That's a masterful bit of splicing and reshooting because in the Rogue cut, that airplane is bound for the X-Mansion, where Mystique messes up Cerebro like she does in the first X-Men movie, so Xavier can't track her. Kind of ironic that in the official version, Xavier implores her to come home, and in the road cut, that's exactly where she's headed, but not for the reasons Xavier would hope. The theatrical version is more streamlined, and we cut to the chase faster without losing any of the meat of the story, but the main reason I'm glad that's gone is because it kind of throws Beast under the bus. Sure, it's nice to deal with Mystique and Beast's attraction established last movie, and that might feel like it's dangling here, minus a token stare from Beast at her here and there, but I don't like that Beast is seduced into becoming an unwitting accomplice to her sabotage, and that he doesn't say anything to Xavier about her being there until it's too late. I can't help but wonder what his relationship is like with Xavier after doing something that would certainly make me question his loyalty. It's not entirely out of character, and Hank is certainly the pessimist of the group, and if the movie had time to explore his uncertain convictions as it does Mystique's, that scene might be necessary. As it is, it feels like part of a half-formed thread, and I'm glad it was retooled. There are a few short lines and exchanges in the road cut I wish had been left in the theatrical version. My favorite is a bit during the setup for the climax in the stadium, where Xavier sits next to a disabled veteran who asks him what happened to him, assuming Xavier became paralyzed in the war. Xavier says, "Friendly fire," and the veteran responds with, "Worst kind." I appreciate the relatively short running time for a movie that so deftly juggles this many characters, but extend it 30 more seconds to keep that exchange. And again, I think the extended exposition dump scene is necessary, and I appreciate Bishop actually talking about whether or not he and the others will even exist if they change the past. So often in time travel stories, our heroes will decide to go back in time and try to alter things just because they think they can create a better world without considering the personal implications to their own lives and other individuals. There's a third, more perfect cut of this material to be made, and knowing the passionate fan editing community, there's probably one floating around out there as we speak. X-Men Days of Future Past is a Rube Goldberg machine, with a zillion moving parts that somehow work in tandem to get us from Armageddon to an exciting, unknown future, partly out of a past we've already explored. I asked a whole lot of questions, some of which I really wish were answered, and some that I'm glad aren't, because part of the fun is in how the movie makes my imagination run away with itself. The most interesting of those questions is what happens to Wolverine in this new version of history after a wild card, more mysterious Mystique than ever, nabs him up in the guise of William Stryker instead of Stryker, and that has sadly already been answered in X-Men Apocalypse, and it's an enormous letdown. It turns out Stryker either got his hands on Wolverine later somehow, or I'm just supposed to ignore that spectacular cliffhanger and pretend like Stryker's eyes don't flash and that really is just Stryker at the end. As, if I understand the production history correctly, it was intended until the eye flash was added in post. At the time of this recording, I'm less confident and enthusiastic about the future of the X-Men franchise than I was when this movie came out. But none of that diminishes the love I have for this film. It's a welcome return to form with Singer and the same sensibilities and flavor he brought from X2, as finally a full-blown character study for Professor Xavier, as an inventive approach to the tired and oversaturated time travel gimmick, and as a lesson in loss of self and learning to master one's own destiny. I'm giving X-Men Days of Future Past a 3.5 out of 4.
There never seems to be enough time to do the things that you want to do once you find them. I looked around enough to know that you're the one I don't want to go.